This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon and welcome to Green 28, Politico Europe's rundown of the people wielding the most influence in the EU's green space. I'm Jan Chański, Politico's senior policy editor. I'm in charge of teams of reporters covering sustainability, energy, climate and mobility, as well as helping out with our coverage of Central and Eastern Europe. The reporters I work with are hugely knowledgeable about the green transformation that is affecting everything from energy systems to biodiversity, global climate negotiations, chemicals policy, and the ongoing shift from fossil fuels to electric cars and trucks. That means we're deeply immersed in policies being developed in Brussels and national capitals, following every move made by politicians, officials, entrepreneurs, managers, researchers, scientists, and campaigners. Today, we want to lift the curtain and show you some of the people who move our world and affect yours. Climate change has been steadily moving up the policy agenda for years, shifting from a fringe concern to the core of the current European Commission's program. That's exemplified by the EU's Green Deal push to make the bloc climate neutral by 2050. But this year, that effort is overshadowed by war. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine touches on almost every aspect of EU policymaking. From the rapid effort to wean the continent off its reliance on Russian energy, to the environmental impact of what Russian troops are doing in Ukraine. While the EU holds emergency summits to deal with the growing Kremlin-provoked energy crisis, policy work on a host of green agenda items continues. Brussels' massive Fit for 55 project aims to cut emissions by 55% by the end of the decade. Doing that means enormous changes to how Europeans live, work, and travel. Negotiations are ongoing on setting such tough emissions limits for cars by 2035 that the sale of new combustion engine cars will be effectively banned, which will have to be twinned with the expensive project of building a network of recharging stations across the continent. The bloc is talking about extending its landmark emissions trading system to transport and buildings, two huge sources of greenhouse gases. Renewable energy is getting a boost. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is being finessed to ensure that European companies won't lose out to manufacturers in laxer jurisdictions while avoiding the danger of a trade war with the US and China. The fuels that power ships and airplanes are being rethought. Farming and forestry will have to become greener. The Social Climate Fund aims to lessen the negative shocks of such a transformation. The Commission also plans to tackle air pollution, cut down on waste, and tighten requirements for companies to prove what's behind their green claims. Getting that huge amount of legislation and regulation through Brussels involves all of the institutions of the EU, national and regional politicians and policymakers, plus armies of NGOs, think tanks, and lobbyists. All of these people shape the EU's greener and cleaner future. That's why we decided to take a look at who has the most influence, for good or ill, on green policy in the coming year. How do we come up with a list? Our team of experienced reporters tapped their networks of sources, plus their own knowledge that comes from day in and day out coverage of their beats in Brussels and across the continent. We sat down and looked at who was affecting the debate on green issues, who was pushing and who was resisting, and the politics and policy impacts that resulted. The aim was to create Politico's first list of the 28 most influential people on the EU's green policies. This year's ranking is the result. After choosing our overall number one, we split the remaining 27 into three groups of 9 rulemakers, influencers, and visionaries, and scored them according to their power, vision, and reach. That means the list isn't simply a compilation of top EU officials and policymakers. The goal is to span the continent and to look at national figures, lobbyists and entrepreneurs, business leaders and activists, anyone who has a profound impact on the policies we cover. Let's take a look at some of the people who make up the Green 28. The rules makers list is, for obvious reasons, heavy with politicians. High up is German Climate and Economy Minister Robert Habeck. He took office with a vow to accelerate Germany's transformation toward climate neutrality and move away from both fossil fuels and nuclear power. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. Rather than greening the German economy, Habeck's immediate priority became procuring enough fossil fuels to keep it going, firing up coal plants, rescuing gas importers, and giving his fellow Greens heartburn by delaying the country's nuclear phase-out. Pascal Canfin is chair of the European Parliament's Environment Committee. The French MEP with the centrist Renew grouping played a key role this year in negotiating difficult compromises between MEPs on the EU's flagship Fit for 55 climate legislation. His trademark approach to resolving parliamentary impasses combines political pragmatism with a firm push for more ambitious green policies and a barely concealed defense of French interests. Other MEPs also playing key roles in climate legislation include Peter Liese, the EPP environmental spokesman, Mohamed Chahim, the S&D vice president, and Jutta Paulus, a first-term MEP, but whose fingerprints are all over Fit for 55. For influencers, we looked at people who may not have obvious political power, but whose views have a major impact on the shape of the bloc's environmental policies. Patrick Pouyanné is no politician, but as CEO of France's Total Energy, he succeeded in superficially riding the green trend without risking the core business. That means lots of high-profile investments in renewable power companies and the rollout of an advertising campaign heavy on landscapes of grazing cows and wind farms, at the same time as engaging in an oil and gas deal signing bonanza. Another power player is Sigrid de Vries, head of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. She's trying to balance pressure on car makers to go green with efforts to allow the internal combustion engine an extra lease of life thanks to e-fuels. Heavy-duty campaigners are also on the list. Anaïs Berthier, head of the Brussels office of Client Earth, and Louisa Neubauer, the youth activist who emerged as the face of Germany's Fridays for Future campaign and is now trying to rebuild the movement. As well, Gabriel Paun, who has made it his mission to record the destruction of old-growth forests in his native Romania. Also making the cut is Alok Sharma, the UK minister who presided over the COP26 climate summit, but is now trying to keep climate on the agenda of the chaotic new British government. Visionaries include politicians, scientists, CEOs, and the academic Carlos Moreno, who want cities redesigned so that everything people need, from shopping to work to entertainment, can be found within 15 minutes of home. That's influencing cities from Paris to Amsterdam. High on the visionaries list is the EU's Green Deal chief Frans Timmermans, who helped devise and is now steering through the Fit for 55 project. The Dutchman has also had one hand on the management of the energy crisis. The Repower EU package Timmermans helped summon after Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now at the heart of a broader realignment of Europe's security. The visionaries list also includes a bevy of entrepreneurs creating the companies that will be crucial in the green transformation, and in the process they hope to become rich. Peter Carlson is the CEO of Northvolt, which is poised to become Europe's first major homegrown battery maker. Environmental activist Antoine Hubert launched Yinsect with the goal of developing insect-based alternatives to meat. Thomas Plantegna helped second-hand fashion marketplace Vinted into becoming a billion-dollar company. Those are most of the people on our list, but not all. We also asked our readers who they thought should be there. We ran a poll for the past couple of weeks, and the results show a tie for the most influential person in the EU's green space: climate campaigner Greta Thunberg and Green Deal chief Frans Timmermans. Tagging along not far behind was David Attenborough, whose broadcasts have exerted a huge influence on promoting environmental issues. He was followed by Environment Commissioner Virginia Sinkevicius. Rounding up the top five was Russian President Vladimir Putin, whose bloody attack on Ukraine has spurred the EU to speed up its green energy push and to cut its reliance on Russian fossil fuels. We will announce the number one at the end of the event, so please stay tuned for that. And now, here is our top rulemaker on Politico's first Green 28, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. Frederiksen didn't set out to become one of the world's greenest leaders. After the 2019 election, her Social Democrats needed green and radical left parties to govern. That, and the Danish public's huge desire for the country to be a leader on climate change, pushed Frederiksen further than she was naturally inclined to go. But she embraced it. Zia Weiss, one of our climate reporters, sat down earlier today and talked to Pascal Canfin. He's one of our top rulemakers and crucial in getting climate files through Parliament.
Pascal Canfin, a French centrist MEP who is chairing the European Parliament's Environment Committee. He's one of our top rulemakers, and we're very glad to have him with us today. So thanks for joining, Pascal.
Thank you.
So, Pascal, 3 years ago, the European Parliament declared a climate emergency. It was one of the first things, really, one of the first big things it did after the parliamentary elections. And now, 3 years on this year, when it came to passing all this legislation to respond to this climate emergency, MEPs seemed a bit more reluctant to agree on a lot of ambitious targets. Can you tell me what happened there?
Well, I must say that I would tend to disagree with your analysis, because precisely last week, there was an attempt by some in the European Parliament to use the resolution we made on energy crisis to send a message saying that, well, we have to slow down on the Green Deal. The priority is now on energy, not on climate anymore, and so on. And they lost. So it means there is still a very clear majority of the Parliament to support and to speed up the Green Deal, because the vast majority of the Parliament think that the Green Deal is not a problem, it's on the contrary part of the solution.
Okay, but when it came to passing legislation this summer, for example, there were some difficulties, and the result was a little bit more ambitious than the Commission, but not very. I mean, was that the best Parliament could do?
You mean on the Fit for 55?
Yes.
Well, no, we are more ambitious on CBAM. We are more ambitious on the timing for the reduction of free allocation. We are more ambitious on CO2 for cars, even if we are very close, both Council and Commission and Parliament, which is good, and that will allow for a swift conclusion in the coming weeks. I would say that I don't find one example within the package where the Parliament is below the level of ambition of the Commission. And that's also can be explained by the fact that that's the red line for Renew. I mean, we always want to push for more ambition. Then we negotiate. Then sometimes we go far, sometimes we go less far. You're right. But it's always more ambitious than the Commission. And that's why, and that's the red line for Renew, where we cannot go below the Commission. So I don't think that there is a lack of ambition in the Parliament. I don't think so. And all the majorities we found were very progressive. And we had a concrete disagreement in this whole package with the Commission, which is the ETS2 or ETS BRT. And we try now, in the context of the trilogue, to bridge the gap between the two institutions.
On that, ETS and the carbon price for households in particular, Parliament and Council are, as you said, quite far apart on this. What would a middle ground on this look like?
Well, that's probably a tens of billion questions. It's too early to say, but what I can tell you is that we are working on it. We are working on it with the rapporteur, Peter Liese. We are working on it with Frans Timmermans' team, and of course with the Czech presidency, because we all know that if we cannot crack this disagreement, because we are diverging between Council and Parliament on this, that could lock the whole ETS deal. So we are fully aware of that. We are working in a constructive mindset to find a deal that will bridge the gap. But as I said a year ago, when the Commission, or a year and a half ago, when the Commission proposed that measure, I said that would be very, very difficult to agree on this. And that's exactly probably the last point on which we will agree in the context of a wider deal. So we know where we are. We know the starting points are different. We know we did agree, but I can tell you that we are also aware that we need to find a compromise to bridge the gap.
Mm. And you were talking about red lines. Are there any on the Fit for 55 negotiations in ETS, in files like LULUCF, in files like CO2 standards for cars? What are some of Parliament's red lines?
Well, on cars, I'm a bit reluctant to answer your question in a transparent manner, because we are exactly in the middle of the negotiation. So if I put all the cards on the table, I'm not sure that it is the best negotiating strategy. So what I can tell you is that on cars, we are close. And we do not consider that we disagree with the recital and with the review clause that was put by the Council on e-fuels. Mm-hmm. There was a vote in the Parliament on e-fuels, and it was voted down twice. So there is a clear, wide majority to say it's not the right way forward for the car industry. So we will see how we deal with this recital and with this review clause, which I know is, of course, a very important element of the deal in the Council. So again, without prejudging of the results, there are obvious trade-offs in the negotiation that we could still improve the text based on Parliament position on some elements here and there, like a top priority for us, which is the just transition fund for car makers, and not for car makers themselves, but for the value chain. That's a top priority for the Parliament.
Well, you said you're close on cars. I mean, are you quite confident that all of this will be wrapped this year? Like the whole Fit for 55 package?
Well, I think that we are in a context where we cannot send a message that would mean we are postponing climate emergency response. And as I said at the beginning, part of the answer to the energy crisis, prices and volumes and quantities and the geopolitical dimension, is precisely to speed up on climate policies. Renewables, energy efficiency, carbon pricing, and so on, decarbonization of industry, hydrogen, and so on. Everything is in the Fit for 55. So we need to deliver soon. That's why we worked a lot. We have almost technical and political trilogues every day, being able to land, hopefully, part of the package, if not all the package, before Sharm, and in any case, under the Czech presidency. I'm not talking here for the red and repower dimension of the package, because of course we as a parliament, we just voted on the red directive 2 weeks ago. So it's just impossible to land in the trilogue soon. And for red, one of the key elements is in the council side. It's the move from 40% of renewables to 45. We did the job. We are at 45 in our position, like the Commission pushed us, rightly so, to do. We did it. We delivered. Now it's up to the Council to deliver. So besides red, and repower, because still repower is still under negotiation at the committees level. For the rest, I think we have to and we can move forward swiftly, and I do as much as I can together with Frans Timmermans to make sure that we land the maximum of the text before the COP27.
Okay, so your committee is also calling on the EU, I think and probably Parliament next week, to update its climate plan, its so-called nationally determined contribution, which is going to the United Nations, right? And so do you think that this should happen also before COP27 with what you're likely agreeing or like what you're trying to agree on the Fit for 55? I mean, should that be formally be part of that?
Yes, of course. I mean, there is definitely no political space to go beyond what we agreed on in the climate law. But in the climate law, we didn't agree on 55. In the climate law, and it was one of the main ask and win from the parliament, we agreed on a figure which, when you put all the regulations in the package, is close to 57. So actually what we have to do in this negotiation, and we are weeks before the end of the potential end of this negotiation, is making sure that we land at close to 57, which would mean that we would have made the whole journey in line with the climate law. To be honest, I don't think there is any option today to go beyond this short term for obvious reasons. But making sure that we land at 57 is already a message that has strong political value in the context of the international negotiation, because we can hear voices from other countries, namely China and others, saying or trying to say, well, you know, the EU is not delivering, the EU is backtracking on climate policies. We are not. We are not, and the best evidence we can demonstrate is precisely to have a deal which is beyond 55, close to 57.
For our viewers who might not be so familiar with the details on this, can you briefly explain how we arrived from 55 to 57 with this?
Okay, so it's about, of course, the 55% of CO2 reductions in 2030 compared to 1990. And when you put the net dimension of it, meaning what the text called the LULUCF, where you take into account forest and other capacity to store carbon, you can deliver on top of ETS, on top of all the elements of the climate package, you can deliver beyond 55 when you put all the figures in the same package, and we end up with 56.6, so close to 57, which is exactly what we negotiated in the climate law. And that's why we really want to land on this text, LULUCF, ETS, CBAM, CARS, ESR, which makes a package that would make sure that we deliver on this close to 57, which is, again, the big number that the Commission will showcase, I would say, in Sharm el-Sheikh. For the rest of the technicalities of each text, I mean, it's really for us as Europeans to negotiate.
You briefly alluded to it, but so do you think that the European Union's focus this year on ensuring there's enough fossil fuels to go around after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has the EU's reputation on climate leadership, has that taken a hit?
Well, that's what some would like to create as a narrative, saying, well, look, the EU is backtracking. What is the reality? The reality is that there is a vast majority of countries, plus the Commission, plus the Parliament, that is considering, on the contrary, that this crisis is an absolute test of our dependency on fossil fuels. Not only on Russian fossil fuels, but on fossil fuels as a whole. And that's the core priority in terms of strategic autonomy, in terms of geopolitical weight, is precisely to massively decrease our dependency from fossil fuels. That's why we speed up on renewables. We, at least from the Parliament side, we are okay to speed up on the Energy Efficiency Directive. We are okay to speed up on the financing of green investment through the repower package. All of that will mean less fossil fuels, plus demand side management reduction, including mandatory peak hours management that was agreed 2 weeks ago by the Energy Council ministers. I mean, that's the massive part of the package. You're right to say that on the other leg is that we buy more gas and we reopen slightly it's really minor as a whole, but it happens for real, coal. But even in the countries where coal is used, I haven't seen any plan to say, well, forget about decarbonization, forget about the Green Deal. We are going to bet on coal massively again. We all agree that it is part of the short-term flexibilities we need to answer the emergency of the situation. But nobody is challenging the fact that it's not the medium-term response. Mm. When it comes to gas, that's the real thing we need to address. When it comes to gas, I mean, when I see the German government looking all over the place for gas supply, including the Green Minister, I can tell you that we know that they cannot do otherwise. But two elements are key. The first one is that we have to do it with the maximum of joint purchasing. Otherwise, we are competing each other. So Italy is competing with Spain, with Portugal, with Germany, with Poland, and so on, which is clearly not our economic, financial, and geopolitical interest. That's why we are in the Parliament pushing hard on these joint purchasing schemes. Yeah. Second, we need to make sure that it is compatible with the Green Deal. And that's my question to Robert Habeck, who is number 2 on your list today. How do you make sure, dear Robert, that the contracts you are signing today as German minister with Qatar, with Algeria, with the US, and so on, are in the medium term compatible with the Green Deal? That's, in my view, the main question to be asked to Robert Habeck.
I mean, you criticize Germany for its gas use, but Pascal,
no, when do
you played a bit of an enabling role here. I mean, in a sense that, like, earlier this year, you were one of the very vocal backers of the inclusion of gas and nuclear in the EU's sustainable finance taxonomy. That was before the invasion of Ukraine, of course, but there was a lot of criticism over including gas, a fossil fuel, in that green investment taxonomy. I mean, now, would you make a different choice? Do you think you're...
So, back to your first remark before your question on taxonomy. I didn't criticize Germany for using and contracting more gas, more LNG with other partners. If I would be in charge in Germany today, I would do the same, obviously. My question is not that one. My question and my remark was, first, we have to do it as Europeans, negotiating with Norway as Europeans to make sure that we can put a negotiated price on the gas through the pipes from Norway. We should be able to have joint purchasing schemes. And that's where I might be criticizing the attitude so far so far, because apparently it's changing, of the German government, but not on the principle of signing these contracts, obviously. Regarding the taxonomy, it's the exact contrary. I mean, look, imagine that we would have said and voted no gas at all in the taxonomy regulation. Or today, even in Germany, when they are now discussing openly the extension of the lifetime of some nuclear power plants, that we would have said, no, under no circumstances, nuclear can be useful for the transition. That would be completely disconnected from the reality we are in. So that's why, more than ever, I think that we made the right choice, meaning gas and nuclear are not green energies. They are not in the green category of the taxonomy. But in some circumstances, under some conditions that are set in the delegated act, they are useful for the transition.
But is the role of gas in the transition? But is the role of gas in the transition not now really in question as a transitional fuel? Has that not changed completely after the invasion?
Well, look, less gas means more coal. That's the reality we are facing very short term. In 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, less gas will be necessary because it would mean more renewables instead. That's why we are speeding up massively on renewables. But very short term now, and the taxonomy applies now, not in 10 years' time, less gas means more coal. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. So that's why we need to precisely first making sure that we do not reopen too much coal, priority number one. Second, that when we reinvest in gas to counter the decrease of the use of Russian gas, we make sure that we have a sort of test of on Green Deal compliance. And that's the core of what I said earlier towards what Germany is doing and with Robert Habeck is doing. We need to make sure that over the next decade, not tomorrow morning, over the next decade, the contracts you are signing are still compatible with the Green Deal. And that's where in the taxonomy criteria. So my ask would say, please, Robert, just apply the taxonomy and that will make the job.
Okay. Pascal, we're running out of time, but I'd like to ask you one last thing in brief, and that is, Fit for 55 on the final stretch. You're hopeful it won't take too much longer. Once that is done, what is the next area of focus for EU climate legislation? What is the next bit?
So many. As a reminder, the Green Deal is 54 legislative pieces. So in parallel of the Fit for 55, we are everything related to circular economy. We have the greening of agricultural practices with the pesticides and nature restoration law. We have the greening of the prudential rules for banks and for insurance companies. All that is now in the process of being voted and negotiated at the EU level. So I can tell you that the scope of what we are doing is definitely not limited to the Fit for 55. It goes way beyond in order to drive this change and to end up with a systemic change, a massive change that, to be honest, is probably one of the historic scale, is to be able to be really climate neutral within one generation. And that's the core of my fight in the parliament.
And on that note, thank you very much, Pascal. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Zia. And now to our next two categories. Our top visionary is Teresa Ribera, Spain's Minister for the Ecological Transition. Ribera has guided Spain's shift away from coal, crafted a pandemic recovery plan that is among the greenest in Europe, and ensured Spain has emerged as a relative winner compared to its neighbors from the energy crisis. Politico has also just broken a story that Ribera will lead Spain out of the Energy Charter Treaty over concerns that it continues to offer generous protections to fossil fuel projects, even after years of talks of reforming the deal. We'll see in the coming days whether that brings further withdrawals from other countries. That buttresses the argument for putting her on the top of our list. And now to our leading influencer. That's William Tots, head of the Green Mobility, Transport and Environment. Now we'll turn to our senior policy reporter, Josh Posaner, for the joint interview with Tots and ASEA's new chief, Sigrid de Vries. Josh?
Thank you, Jan. So yes, my name is Josh Posaner. I'm a senior policy reporter at Politico, responsible for writing about mobility coverage, principally, joined by the Director General of ASEA, Europe's chief car lobbyist, Sigrid de Vries. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
And the Executive Director of Transport and Environment, William Tots. I was a bit confused about the job titles because they're quite similar, but they're very different. But
We should align. What's in your name?
Yeah. Let's see about that, because we've got a lot to talk about over the next 20 minutes. You're both on the list in our influencer category. Will, you number 1 today. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Sigrid, you're number 3. So it's probably fair to imagine that in previous years, given the state of the auto industry, it might have been flipped in the other direction. We're sitting here right now because the EU attempt to set a zero emissions mandate for the sale of new cars and vans from 2035 onwards is a pretty big deal for climate policy, and that's principally why you're both on the list. Now, you represent opposite sides of the same debate on this issue in a way, and you've been sparring regularly over the years, maybe not in person, but certainly through your teams and respective reports, etc. I wanted to ask you first, Sigrid, before we get into a big debate on it. Now, the industry at large agrees that by 2050 we need to clean up, right?
Absolutely.
So when you look at fleet renewal targets or the average time it takes for people to change the cars on the road, that's around 15 years. Mm-hmm. So surely it makes sense for the EU to mandate a zero emissions policy for 2035, giving your industry 15 years to clean up and get all the old cars off the road, no?
Well, I think such a simple calculation is a vast oversimplification of reality of transport and mobility, and also reality of society in all. And as you said, our industry is embracing that 2050 goal. 1 in 5 vehicles today has newly sold vehicles today has a plug. So this transformation is going very quickly, and industry is really embracing that. But asking engineers and also business people to embrace a target that bans technology is at the other side of the spectrum. It doesn't reflect the complexity of society, of transport and mobility. There are vast differences across Europe. There's cars and trucks. There is differences when it comes to wealth and well-being of people. And there is also the real risk attached of creating dependencies, and we see that also today in today's reality, that is a risk. In this case, being dependent on raw materials that you need for battery production. So putting all your eggs in one basket is, from a principle point of view, never a really good idea. And the good news is that there are various solutions available to go for that goal of reducing carbon emissions, because indeed, as you say, that's clearly the goal also of this industry, fully committed, and that's the transformation is in full swing, no doubt.
And to be clear, the legislation that we're talking about, the 2035 zero emissions mandate, would apply to cars and vans. Trucks are a different issue. We're going to get onto that later in the conversation. I should just tell our viewers right at the beginning, I forgot to straight away, is that you can, of course, ask a question, as we always do in these sessions, on Slido. It's hashtag PoliticoGreen28. I will then see the question here and I'll put it to our panel. But just to move straight on to William, just to be slightly combative from my side, you've been calling for a long time for a zero emissions mandate. And the way it's effectively drafted now means e-mobility is really the only practical option. You've got to a certain extent what you wanted all along, but Sigrid represents an industry that's a pretty critical driver of the European economy at large. And going electric, so many car makers tell us and suppliers, is going to cost thousands of jobs across the block. If they've committed to 2050, why not let them just get on with it as best they can now and find their own way to that overall goal?
The reason we cannot let car makers just get on with it is because, on the one hand, we have a climate crisis. And we saw that over summer, heat waves, fires, massive floods in Pakistan. The climate crisis is accelerating. So we cannot just take big industries' promises. We need to be, very clear on what the direction of travel is. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that we have an industry that has built engines for the last 100 years. It's an incumbent industry, and it's difficult for incumbents to change. It's one of the reasons why we've been slower to change than the Chinese and the Teslas. What we need to do in Europe is we need to make it very clear to our industry, not just the car makers, but everybody in the ecosystem, that the direction of travel is zero emission and that we have 12, 13 years to get to that goal. This is the only way that we can successfully manage this massive industrial transformation. And by the way, it's not just important for the CEOs and the companies. It's also important for the workers. We shouldn't be telling people employed in diesel parts that diesel engines have a great future. That is not the case. The future is largely going to be electric, and we need to be supporting those people to find new jobs. But you don't do that by denying what the future is.
So if we assume that because this is the reality of the legislation, it's on tailpipe emissions, does that mean, Sigrid, that batteries are the only way to decarbonise the auto industry?
Well, that's the short-term solution, definitely. If we need to meet those targets and their sales targets, so you need to comply with the regulation, then battery electric is the first way to go. Of course, there's also fuel cells, there's hydrogen applications that can also come into play, but it will be a staged introduction and development. That is where industry is going, and I fully agree. This is also what industry sees and does. I mean, we see all those models coming out, and they are being produced. The direction is electrification, certainly for passenger cars, but also for trucks, by the way. I was in Hanover last week at the transportation fair. All of the truck manufacturers in Europe have either models already in production for sales or are very close to bringing them into production. So that's the road. But banning a technology is really very, very finite, and the risks attached to that are vast, and those risks indeed also pertain to workers and to jobs and employment, and the risks pertain to the competitiveness of this industry in Europe. Europe needs a very strong competitive industry to support its economy, to support its strategic autonomy goals. And that needs to work out. CEOs of a company have this very broad responsibility, right, to balance out different needs, different interests. And one of them is making products that are environmentally friendly and that contribute to decarbonizing our world, our society, but they also have other interests to take care of, and so do policymakers.
We can't have a serious conversation about this legislation without talking about e-fuels, because the state of the art now is that we have the second trilogue, the final interinstitutional talks about that legislation, whether or not to set the effective engine ban on the 27th of October. The standoff, as we heard a little bit from earlier from Pascal Canfin, is that the council would like some incorporation that would allow e-fuels to be used in vehicles in combustion engines even after 2035. Is that a solution that you back, Sigrid?
Well, we would very much like to see indeed what the text is of any recital and what the value of that would be. But I think it's important to emphasize here that it's not just about so-called e-fuels, it's about renewable liquid fuels. We will be living with combustion engine vehicles for a long time to come, those that are currently on the road also driving around. And we need to deal with emissions from those vehicles as well. You need solutions for that. So for that reason, it's very indeed important to also look at the opportunities for decarbonization of transport and mobility that are offered by renewable liquid fuels. And those include e-fuels, but certainly not only. It starts probably with these other alternatives that are out there and also closer to production and are more available, but also cheaper to have.
So, William, renewable liquid fuels, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm noticing a slight change in narrative coming from the oil industry and the engine industry. It used to be e-fuels, and now it's actually, e-fuels maybe later. First, we will have renewable fuels. What that means is biofuels.
We've been consistent on this, huh?
Sure, but we were always talking. It was always e-fuels, and now it's but we've got all these beautiful biofuels. Having worked on renewable fuels in Europe for a decade, I can tell you that biofuels are not exactly a success story. The idea that we would power hundreds of millions of cars with large quantities of biofuels, I think is a really, really bad idea. And I think I'd like to say something else about the e-fuels. I mean, we've been discussing for the last 3 years about e-fuels. We ran a test. We wanted to test the air quality performance of e-fuels, and we had to actually produce the e-fuel ourselves because it wasn't on the market. We were, in that year, probably the largest producer of e-fuels in Europe. Now, e-fuels are never gonna be a scalable solution for cars. It's a complete distraction, and I have to give you credit for making everybody talk about this for the last 3 years. But it's, frankly, it's a fantasy.
Well, I'm not defending the e-fuel industry here, but I do think you're not doing justice to the many engineers that have looked at it and come to different conclusions. And again, I would say that we need to seriously look at the opportunities offered by renewable liquid fuels, because we will have many vehicles for a long time still on the grounds, on the roads, that we need to also look at for decarbonizing our society and our economy. And it's a serious issue, and that I understand legislators have first now looked at new vehicles, they've looked at the supply of new vehicles, but there are really dimensions of this whole discussion, the social dimension, the just transition that was also mentioned by Commissioner Timmermans. But also, indeed, the existing cars and trucks and buses on the roads, and as I mentioned before, the new dependencies we may be creating because of the availability of materials, battery supply, a viable battery production, the whole value chain that we need in Europe. All of these dimensions really also need to be taken care of and good looking at.
And there, of course, go ahead, William, in a second, but there's all, of course, talk about changing the whole methodology behind how these targets are calculated to move from the tailpipe emissions to well to wheel. That's pending and will be looked at in the future. William.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost track for a moment. No. Yeah.
All right, well, look, I was going to move on to something.
I wanted to react something, but now I forgot.
Maybe infrastructure, because that I haven't mentioned.
Well, I think this is an interesting topic. Sadly, it's something
I remember.
You got it.
Yeah. See, we can agree immediately if it's about existing fleets. For that, we don't need to touch the car CO2 standards to put biofuels in existing fleets. For that, we have the Renewable Energy Directive. It has existed for a long time.
It
has very high.
Do enough yet, but.
Okay, we can talk about changing it, but you don't need to touch the car CO2 standards. What the oil industry and the engine industry and the biofuels industry have been doing for the last decade or so is constantly trying to get into the car CO2 standards and try to open them up to fuels so that we can slow down the transition away from engines that rely on liquid fuels.
But that's not the position of the auto industry. They are not slowing down any transition here. And I think you can see it around you on the roads already today, and in the portfolios they are presenting and also putting on show. There is the next week, there is the Paris Motor Show. Again, go and have a look.
Very good. Then we don't need it in the car CO2 standards. That's great.
But I mean, we're talking in the realm of hypothetical solutions here when we talk about liquid renewable fuels, as you say, Sigrid, simply because at the moment it looks like they're not going to be allowed under the CO2 regulation as it stands in the conversation today. But to talk about infrastructure, which is something that to a certain extent you both agree on, which would be sad for the nature of our debate, because we'd like to see you disagree more. But what is the state of the rollout of charging infrastructure to make the electric mobility transition work, and who needs to pay for the charging infrastructure to be built on our streets?
It's in a very bad state, because today there are about 300,000 charging points available, public charging points, and 50% of those are in just 2 countries, Germany and the Netherlands. And there are, I think, 7 countries in Europe. We have that data available on our website that don't even have 1 charging point per 100 kilometers of road. So it's in a bad state, and something needs to happen very, very quickly, very soon. This is a crucial enabling condition to get e-mobility really to fly and to get off the grounds or on the roads. For trucks, it's even worse.
We'll come on to trucks, yeah. But William?
We are at the beginning of a massive transition. And most electric car drivers charge their car at home. There are often people that have a place in front of their home where they can charge their cars. This is 20-30% of the population in Europe. Now, it is clear that if you want to go to 100%, you need a massive transformation. Not just on the highways, not just in the cities. You need to get to the buildings. Shared buildings is a big challenge, and we need to make it much easier for people in these buildings. So it is not just about who pays, because installing a charge point in a shared apartment building, maybe it costs you 1,000, 2,000 euros. That might not be the blocker. The blocker is actually that your copropriété, that your landlord doesn't allow you to do it. We need to change the laws so that people can just do it.
And the grid needs to be prepared as well, because then you may have the plan and the willingness, you have everybody agreed, because I agree, it needs to happen in buildings as well. And then there are either permit problems, or there are all kinds of rules that hold against it. And the grid isn't prepared. And that's an issue, especially also for heavy-duty vehicles. It's not capable.
Okay, and we'll come on to heavy-duty vehicles in a second, but we look at Tesla, for example, with the supercharging network. That's been very, very popular with consumers. Also, NIO now is coming. The Chinese car maker is entering the European market with promises of battery swap stations. Is the onus not on car makers to help solve this problem, either by investing in charging infrastructure networks themselves, or by thinking up these kind of smart, innovative models of battery swapping that competitors are doing?
It's and it's happening. Some of our members have actually joint ventures also to get charging infrastructure off the ground, but it needs to be and. There needs to be public investment, especially in those areas where there is not such an easy business case to be had. But of course, car manufacturers, vehicle manufacturers are taking their responsibility. They're doing their bit on that side too. But it really needs to be a massive effort from everybody involved.
But it's important to emphasize that the private sector is going to play a huge role in this. This is a new market that is being created. Tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people are going to rely on those chargers on a daily basis. There's a lot of money to be made there, which is also why there's a lot of big companies that are now installing charging points, and they're gonna do a lot of the work for us. So it's not the public authorities or the public purse that has to bankroll all of this.
But we shouldn't make it sound too easy. I heard a very passionate plea just now that we should not leave this to car manufacturers and their promises, but that's the same here. For enabling conditions, we should not just say, oh, it will happen, just like it won't. It's a massive transformation, and it needs a lot of effort and working together.
I just want to take one question that we have from Isatou Sa. Thank you very much for the question. This is, are there plans to address key product value chains, ICT, batteries, vehicles, and packaging, etc.? I mean, this is all the sustainable policies, but it's not just CO2 standards that are affecting the auto industry, right?
No. Of course, there are many other standards when it comes to sustainability. Is that the question?
Yeah, I think effectively, is there more coming on things like batteries, which there naturally is, also on end of life for vehicles, which I think there is too. Probably.
Yeah.
You guys know more about this than I do.
No, I mean, let's be clear. The auto industry is the most regulated industry in Europe, and that's for very good reasons. It's the environment, safety. So the product needs to meet high standards, and it does. And it's a volume product at the same time. Millions of units coming off the production lines. And that's what the European industry is also very good at. And that's also why they still have an edge and a competitive edge also compared to competitors coming from elsewhere. So indeed, there are many issues that we need to take care of at the same time. And that's also why we argue so often that regulations need to be proportionate. Because you want to have feasible regulation in place, well-timed to enable transformation, but also allow for competitiveness.
And we talk about feasible, well-timed legislation, Euro 7, which to our audience, who I'm sure they've heard about it, but just in case anybody that is a bit confused over the difference between the CO2 standards in Euro 7 affects all non-CO2 pollutants. That's been expected from the European Commission for more than a year now. It's delayed again today to November the 9th, we just reported. William, do you think this is acceptable? Because this, of course, will affect auto industry engine production way before 2035.
I think the car industry is good at portraying itself as as a victim of this, the regulatory urges of the European Commission. I think the reality is that the car industry is thriving, has made phenomenal profits in recent years, and that's good. I'm not unhappy about that. When it comes to Euro 7, the question is a simple one. Are the vehicles that we are putting on the market in the next 12, 13 years, and we're talking about 100 million vehicles, not just cars, but also vans and trucks, are those the cleanest that they could possibly be, within reasonable expectations? We have asked, the Commission have asked scientists and engineers to answer that question. They spent years on this. And the conclusion was, we can massively improve the tailpipe exhaust emissions of engined vehicles, NOx emissions, particle emissions, brake emissions, ammonia emissions, and we can do that for relatively low cost, a few €100 per vehicle. That's the cost of having your car yellow rather than black. Now, I think it is absolutely in the public interest to have that standard and to have it as soon as possible. I think it's really very simple. And of course, the car industry says, yeah, but there's all these regulations. Yeah, you're a very big industry with a very big environmental impact. And this is about the health of people.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's all nice and fair to make things sound very simple, but things aren't in reality. And I think you are referring to numbers that I don't recognize, that our industry doesn't recognize. And again, we need to look at benefits. The vehicles today coming off the production lines with Euro 6 and the letter behind, they are the most advanced vehicles you can get. They have reduced pollutant exhaust emissions coming out of them by great numbers and percentages. If we would focus on fleet renewal and put on Euro 6 vehicles on the roads in combination with vast electrification, we can reduce pollutant emissions by 80% by 2035, whereas a very stringent Euro 7, based on the Commission vehicles, would only reach about 5% for cars and not even 2% for trucks.
Okay.
So that's the proportionality we're looking at. And with all investments geared towards going electrification, to distract by putting a Euro 7 regulation on the table that would be very costly, is just not the smartest of ideas.
So let's just dwell on this question for a second, because you hear a lot of industry executives, mostly, of course, off the record, because this is, in a way, it doesn't look good in the whole green scheme of things these days to be saying this kind of stuff. But they say that when we build a new engine and we innovate a new engine, we typically try to recoup that cost, that research and development phase, over 10 to 15 years. New Euro 7 standard would, let's say, apply from 2027, as we all expect. That would give the industry 8 years, probably in practice a lot shorter, to recoup the investment in that engine. Is what you're saying that we should just sack off and forget Euro 7 and leave the industry on its trajectory to cutting out engines altogether by 2035, if that's what we're doing, and actually just stick with the latest iteration of Euro 6? Is that your preference?
We're in favor of improving air quality where it's proportionate and where it can be done, but we should not be distracted from the main course of action, which is electrification, which will also benefit air quality. That's what we're saying. And it's not about looking green or looking good. We're trying to bring a realistic perspective here on the table and into the debate. There are real issues out there that need to be addressed and that industry is dealing with.
So we're in 2022 now. Most industry executives say that a 2035 engine ban effectively means 2032 for when sales of engine-installed cars will start to drop off. I think in practice, nobody will buy an engine-installed car in 2034. The auto industry, I guess, will want to drop them.
I don't know why that would be the case.
But could you not concede that perhaps one thing at a time, that an industry that's seeing a decline in sales through this year compared to the pre-pandemic period should be left to innovate its way towards batteries, naturally, if that's going to be the direction that's decided later this month? And Euro 7 is, as Sigrid said, a distraction.
I understand that this is the perspective of an auto executive. Of course, lawmakers are asking you to spend money on something that is not going to be around for a very, very long time. I understand that you don't like that. But my perspective is not the perspective of the profits of the automakers. My perspective is the perspective of the public health of hundreds of millions of Europeans. And as I said before, we will still be selling lots of engine vehicles, not just cars, but also vans and trucks in the next 12 years. Are we making those vehicles as clean as we possibly can? That is what Euro 7 is about.
Indeed, I agree.
And these pollutants, of course, are associated directly with very serious health,
Of course.
health problems in cities. We're sitting in a city which often has endemic air pollution problems. So
Absolutely, and Euro 6D is a vast improvement compared to the Dieselgate vehicles we had before. But it's not a pollution-free vehicle. There's still a lot of NOx coming out of that vehicle.
There's not a lot of NOx coming out of the vehicle. No, it's a vastly improved vehicle.
Compared to before.
And if you look at studies, and air pollution is a local issue that comes from different sources, and the contribution by transport to pollution is going down quickly. And with the further fleet renewal to Euro 6 and electrification, you will see major improvements, more than Euro 7, than a stringent Euro 7 could achieve. I think there are ways to further improve. And as I said, industry is in favor of improving air quality where it's proportionate and feasible and reasonable, but it should not distract from making these huge investments in electrification.
Okay, but you both hope that Euro 7 lands on the 9th of November.
Yes.
No more delays. So at least we know what's coming, what's on the table. I have no idea how much time we have left. I presume we're running over, but I do just want to finish on trucks, which is where we started a little bit at the beginning, because of course 2035 target now only applies to cars and vans. On November the 30th, unless that changes, we'll find out what the Commission wants to do with heavy duty vehicles. William, I should ask you this first, probably because you were at an event unveiling a report today. Should it also be 2035 for trucks?
The first thing to say is that trucks are a huge issue. In terms of, you got 2% of vehicles emitting 25% of road transport emissions. And those emissions are going up. And that's because, we all commission, we all buy stuff online. We have an economy that is more reliant on freight. We got diesel consumption going up. And that's going to continue in the next couple of years. So we got to deal with freight. It was left out of the Green Deal initially. It's sort of an afterthought. I think that's a mistake. We commissioned the study to look at, because for the freight businesses, it's all about total cost of ownership. It's all about, can we make this work financially? We know that we can have electric trucks on the road. We know they can drive 500 kilometers or even 800 kilometers. The question is, can we make it work financially? What the study by TNO, a Dutch research group, shows is that by 2030, in almost all use cases, the TCO of an electric truck is going to be better than a diesel truck. And that's just because, electric trucks are going to be extremely efficient. They drive a lot, so you got good payback times. 2030 is too soon. But 2035, I think, is absolutely feasible. And the reason why I think it's feasible is because you're looking at very much the same supply chains, the same skills as for the automotive transition for cars. It's the same. It's not exactly the same batteries, but it's the same supply chains. And so the question is, if we do it for cars, why don't we just do it for trucks as well?
I agree that trucks certainly shouldn't be an afterthought. Not for Euro 7 and not for CO2 emissions either. I think the proposal is now coming only in the first quarter, maybe late this year or the first quarter of next year, by the way. I think the issue with trucks, with commercial vehicles, I fully agree. It's all about TCO, total cost of ownership. So the enabling conditions are almost even more important when it comes to commercial vehicle transport. That also includes buses, by the way, than when talking about cars. Now, if you, again, put a sales target on the industry, and industry is gearing towards delivering on that, and it's on show, it's on sale. The backbone of decarbonizing commercial vehicle road transport will be delivered by electrification and also hydrogen applications. But you need the refueling and the recharging infrastructure in place, and you need to achieve cost parity because indeed an operator needs to be able to, in a competitive way, run his or her business. So, it's crucially important that these enabling additions will be put into place, and today that's really far out. So before setting targets for trucks, and again, industry is on its way, it's transforming, it's going there, but we need to be very careful with setting the targets. Okay,
but William was quite clear on 2035 based on the report that was issued today. And I expect now that both him and his team will be very, very active in pushing that agenda over the next few weeks in the run-up to November the 30th. What will you be saying? Which date should it be?
Well, our commercial vehicle members have actually been very proactive, and they've put out a report a couple of months ago, also backed up by scientific research, and they are really committed to fossil-free transport, commercial transport by 2040. So that's what they're working towards.
Which is a 5-year gap is pretty tight compared to the previous conversations that you guys used to have, and the breadth of ambition of the auto industry was nowhere near. The
gap is not just the timing. The gap is also that we say it should be zero emission, so either fuel cell or battery electric. ASEA is apparently saying that all sorts of biofuels
Not all
and
sorts.
e-fuels.
The backbone will be battery electric and hydrogen, renewable hydrogen. Absolutely, the vast majority will be that, but there will be the need also to still use internal combustion engine-based vehicles there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sigrid, William, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you both again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you again to our guests for joining us for that rigorous debate on the future of the auto industry. I'm now going to switch seats and invite my boss, Jan Chensky, back to the stage.
Thanks very much, Josh. Really good panel. Now it's the time you've all been waiting for, the time for the top of the list of our Green 28, the person with the most influence on EU green policy, for good or ill. And I didn't add those words by mistake. Just a reminder that the Green 28, it's not an award. We're looking at who has the most influence, the biggest impact on the EU's green and sustainability policies. So when Politico's reporters covering sustainability, energy, climate, mobility, agriculture, and more got together to think it over, one name topped our list: Vladimir Putin. Our choice may seem shocking, but it's clear that it took a war criminal who unleashed an illegal and bloody invasion of Ukraine to dramatically speed up the EU's green transition. There is no argument that he's had, and will continue to have, an enormous impact on the bloc's green policies. Just a few months ago, hard power advocates could dismiss calls to cut emissions as economically damaging frippery. No more. Now, insulating buildings, cutting red tape to make it easier to build wind towers, and switching to EVs to cut the use of fossil fuels are national security measures that combine with sending rifles, tanks, and rockets to Ukraine. Putin has also underscored the danger of relying on an imperialistic dictatorship for crucial energy, strengthening the argument for boosting renewables. Finally, the depredations of Russian soldiers in Ukraine has wrought enormous environmental damage on Ukraine. As we said, our list ranks influence for good or ill, and Putin is number one this year. Now I'd like to turn to Josh and to our senior climate correspondent, Carl Matheson, to talk about how and why Putin tops the Green 28. Welcome, guys.
Hey, yeah.
So this was what's your thinking? Carl, you've just written a story, which is, I think, going live right now on our choice of Putin, looking at some of the numbers behind that decision. What's your thought?
Well, I guess it was, even in the week of the invasion, we started talking about what this might mean for the EU's climate policy, the EU's energy policy, and it was clear that energy security was going to dominate European politics for a considerable length of time. But there was certainly a rhetorical theory being very quickly emerging from a lot of EU politicians that this would simultaneously progress the EU's climate goals, because the answer to less gas is, in the near term, anything you can get your hands on, but in the future, it's clean energy. And the EU had sort of started its Green Deal project, and the theory was that this would be an accelerant. We wrote that story, but we were very, very careful at that time because there really wasn't any sign that it would actually happen. And then about 6 weeks ago, we started calling every think tank, every analyst we could, and saying, where's the evidence? We're 7 months into the war. Are you starting to see steel in the ground, investments happening, installations of heat pumps. Like, where are we seeing the evidence that this theoretical surge is now occurring? And I think we've come up with a really solid indication that at least the beginning of that acceleration.
What are some of the more striking numbers that you've seen on that?
So, I mean, heat pumps is one of the things. So the heat pumps are obviously the electric version of heating, and they are supposed to replace gas boilers, which is kind of Europe's heating of home heating of choice. And we've seen a phenomenal surge across many EU countries, not all of them, but many EU countries, a doubling of installation rates in many places. Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Italy. So there's been a surge in heat pumps, and these are permanent installations, so these permanently eradicate gas demand, but they're also there's a shift in mentality that it takes. We are now seeing Europeans considering heat pumps for the first time as affordable, an affordable alternative that they actually think are, I have a choice here between a gas boiler and a heat pump, and I'm going to go with a heat pump because over not much time, it's going to pay itself off. So there's that. There's been a huge surge in solar panel imports from China. Data on solar panel installations is very hard to get across the EU, but we've seen a huge surge in imports from China, which is where most of the solar panels in the EU are made. So those things, we've also seen big political declarations, so EU leaders coming together and saying they're going to cooperate over wind power in the Baltic, in the North Sea. So it's also bringing together at the very top level of politics now this idea that clean energy is a security issue for Europe. And I think that's the fundamental thing that Putin has inadvertently achieved.
Josh, you're based in Berlin. You live in the city. What's your assessment of? I mean, one of the quick reactions that people have is, look at Germany. They're backtracking on their nuclear pledge, and they're turning to coal to burn just to generate much needed electricity. Do you think, looking at the trend, are they actually reversing, or is there a sense that this is, I think as Pascal Canfin said in his interview, this is a short-term retrenchment, and that there is an accelerated path that would justify our choice of Putin as the most influential?
I mean, the advent of war and Putin's actions in Ukraine have effectively ripped up more than a decade of German energy policy. And accelerated trends in renewable energy anyway. And so if you look now at what the German government is doing, yes, it's taking short-term measures to improve its own energy security. These in themselves are very controversial, but for sure the long-term impact will be to accelerate the shift to renewable energy and away from gas. It feels like generations ago that we were sat around conference tables talking about gas as a bridge fuel. Do you remember that?
Do you think the bridge fuel issue, it's dead, that is just not going to happen?
In my eyes and the people that I speak to, that whole argument has just disappeared now. It's a case of a crisis, and the crisis is not just going to be this winter, it's going to be in the next few years, but the long-term destination is clear. And, I write a lot for you about electric vehicles. I think there's no better argument for an electric vehicle now, or advert for an electric vehicle, than seeing a Putin speech or looking at the images that we're seeing from Ukraine. And so already the shift to electric cars that we've just spoken about was on a sharp upwards trend. It's accelerating massively. And what also I think is quite interesting, I agree with everything Carl said, but is this new kind of strategic thinking from the European Commission that we've seen. And Ursula von der Leyen talking now, which is a topic we didn't talk about with the two guests on the car industry, but how do you secure up the kind of raw material access, the kind of raw materials that you relied on Russia from before? So it's this whole thing that, yes, we're taking short-term measures to ease energy security, but the long-term trend in thinking now is very clear. You cannot rely on Russia for any energy resources. Neither would we frankly like to anymore. And so therefore, we're looking at alternatives in the medium and long term.
You actually put a point, I just want to raise that question with Carl. We don't want to come back to Russian energy. Carl, do you think that that's actually the case, that if Putin disappears from the political scene, we have a President Navalny in the Kremlin, would everybody sort of breathe a sigh of relief, go, well, will that one undestroyed thread of Nord Stream 2, let's start pumping gas, and we can go back to our very comfortable relationship with a different Russia? Or is this a permanent change that no matter what happens in Russia, we are not going back to the dependence that we had on Russian energy?
I feel like a politician. I need to say I don't answer hypotheticals, Jan. I don't know. I think that obviously it's very hard to predict that. But what is clear is that whatever happens in Russia's future, Europe has had to learn an extremely difficult lesson about over-dependence on one supplier, and particularly a supplier that is, historically, that historically fluctuates between different political stances towards Europe. So, look, I don't. No, I'm not going to look into the crystal ball on that one. But it would be very hard to imagine that Europe would go back to being as dependent on Russia as it has been in the past for its energy. And just to say, like, this is at the heart of the European Union package that it brought out very rapidly on the heels of the war, the Repower EU package. And this is kind of the structural framework that the EU has laid out for a permanent end to fossil fuel reliance on Russia. And I think, and there's lots of things in that package. I think what's really interesting is that many elements of that package, which are obviously it's a call to politicians and capitals in Europe to make structural change. They are not really happening. Like, we are seeing the political signalling around this is that there's a debate still in even in Brussels about whether or not to increase the bloc's renewable energy target. That may or may not happen. There's still a debate about the financing of this Repower EU package. So the political signals are kind of mixed on this. Maybe they'll work their way through, maybe they'll. But what we're seeing already is that the market, that consumers, that businesses are fundamentally responding to the fact that gas is now so expensive that the clean energy alternatives are just much more appealing. So that's where we're seeing the big signal. Yes, the politicians are sort of having little bites at this, but there hasn't been a kind of big... Politicians have basically just been very distracted about what's going to happen this winter, I would say, too distracted to think about the kind of 5 to 10 year strategic plan that the European Commission, for its part, has actually laid in front of them. So will that happen? I would say probably, but at the moment it's the market that we're seeing the response from.
Quick final question before we wrap up. Did we make the right choice, choosing Putin to be the most influential?
It was the only choice.
Only choice.
Yeah.
Josh?
Yeah, I think so. And especially to make clear, this is not an award.
Yeah.
But, to somebody that's played such a significant role in steering the debate on energy and the transition to clean energies, I think, as Carl said, it's without a doubt.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Please let us know what you think of our list. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today and our viewers online. Please share your feedback to livepolitico.eu and check our website for events updates. We have great events coming up over the next year. Our Sustainable Future Week happens in person from November 29th to December 1st. Again, I'm Jan Chański, and this was Politico Europe's Green 28 for 2022. Thank you all for watching.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.